Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to discover that someone had been silently loving you from afar for years, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their heart? That's exactly what happened to me on a Tuesday night in Manhattan, and it changed everything. The Meridian Penthouse was a symphony of controlled chaos, exactly the kind of high-stakes event that made my pulse race with equal parts terror and exhilaration. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors as Manhattan's elite mingled beneath soaring floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the glittering city below. I'd been coordinating corporate events for 3 years, but tonight's charity gala for the Romano Foundation was the biggest contract I'd ever landed, the kind of account that could finally establish my little company as a serious player in New York's competitive events industry. I smoothed my black cocktail dress and checked my tablet for the 100th time, scanning the evening's timeline with the focused intensity of a general preparing for battle. Everything had to be perfect. The silent auction was bringing in record bids. The 5-course dinner had been executed flawlessly by the catering team, and the string quartet was transitioning seamlessly into the jazz ensemble for dancing. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I moved through the crowd, invisible in the way that event coordinators learned to be, ensuring that every detail unfolded exactly as planned while the guests enjoyed their evening oblivious to the countless moving parts that made it all possible. But despite the evening's success, exhaustion was starting to creep in around the edges of my adrenaline high. I'd been on my feet for 12 hours straight, and the tension in my shoulders reminded me that I hadn't eaten anything more substantial than a handful of canapés since this morning. The last few months had been particularly brutal, not just because of work, but because of Marcus. My ex-fiancé had been calling constantly since our breakup 6 weeks ago, leaving increasingly aggressive voicemails that made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Tonight, thankfully, my phone had been blissfully quiet, and I was determined not to let thoughts of him ruin what should have been a career-defining triumph. I ducked into the kitchen alcove where the staff had set up their coordination station, grateful for a moment away from the crowd's energy. The catering manager gave me a thumbs up as he directed the dessert service, and I allowed myself a small smile of satisfaction. Everything was running like clockwork. I deserved a 30-second break, and maybe half a glass of champagne to celebrate. The champagne flute felt cool against my palm as I lifted it from the tray that one of the servers had just refreshed. The bubbles tickled my nose as I took a careful sip, savoring the crisp, expensive taste that I rarely indulged in. For just a moment, I let myself enjoy the view through the massive windows, the way the city lights sparkled like earthbound stars, the sense of accomplishment that came from seeing months of careful planning come together perfectly. That's when I saw it. Something glinted at the bottom of my glass, catching the light from the chandeliers above. At first, I thought it might be a piece of ice or some kind of garnish that had somehow ended up in the champagne. But as I tilted the flute, my breath caught in my throat. There, nestled against the curved glass like a secret waiting to be discovered, was a ring. Not just any ring, but a stunning piece that even my untrained eye could tell was worth more than I made in several months. A perfect cushion-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes, set in what looked like platinum. My hands started to shake. This had to be a mistake, some kind of mix-up with the catering, or perhaps a prank by one of the other vendors. But even as my rational mind tried to find a logical explanation, something deeper inside me whispered that this was intentional, that someone had placed this ring in my champagne glass deliberately. The question was who and why. "You're not supposed to wear jewelry this expensive to work events, Elena," I told myself, using the voice of reason that had gotten me through 3 years of building my business from nothing. "You're supposed to be invisible, professional, forgettable." But there was something about the ring that made it impossible to look away, something that made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with work stress and everything to do with possibility. That's when I felt him behind me. I hadn't heard footsteps approaching over the music and conversation, but suddenly there was a presence at my back, warm and solid and somehow familiar. The air seemed to shift, charged with an electricity that made every nerve ending in my body come alive with awareness. Dante Romano, I realized with a start. The Foundation's founder, the evening's host, the man whose mother's memorial service I had coordinated 3 years ago during my very first month in business. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and striking green-gray eyes that seemed to see everything. Tonight, he wore a tailored black tuxedo that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body, and when he moved, it was with the kind of confident grace that suggested he was someone used to being in control. I'd thought about him more than I should have over the past 3 years, remembering the way he'd looked at me during our planning meetings for his mother's service, the unexpected gentleness in his voice when he talked about honoring her memory, the generous bonus he'd given me afterward that had literally saved my struggling business. But I'd always assumed his attention was simply the courtesy of a grieving son grateful for professional service rendered during a difficult time. Apparently, I'd been wrong. "It's for you," he said quietly, his voice low and rough with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. His breath was warm against my ear, and I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made my pulse flutter in a way that definitely wasn't professional. I've been carrying it for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. I turned slowly, the champagne flute still trembling in my hand, and found myself looking up into those remarkable eyes that had haunted my dreams more often than I cared to admit. 3 years. I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the music and conversation surrounding us. But I was engaged to Marcus then. I was with someone else. "I know," he said simply. "That's why I waited." The words hit me like a physical force, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my knees go weak. He'd waited. For 3 years, he'd carried this ring, watched me from whatever distance he maintained, respected my relationship with Marcus even when that relationship was slowly destroying me from the inside out. How had I missed the signs? How had I been so blind to feelings that must have been there all along? My phone buzzed against my clutch, and I saw Marcus's name flash across the screen. Again. Even now. Even tonight when I was supposed to be celebrating my biggest professional success, he couldn't leave me alone. The contrast was jarring. Marcus, who had spent our entire 2-year relationship trying to control and diminish me, and Dante, who had quietly loved me from afar without asking for anything in return. But this was insane. I barely knew this man beyond a few business meetings and the polite interactions we'd had at various events over the years. Yes, I'd been attracted to him from that very first meeting, had felt a pull toward him that I'd ruthlessly suppressed because I was supposedly in love with Marcus. And yes, there had been moments when I'd caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin warm and my heart race. But love? Marriage? The ring in my champagne glass suggested something far deeper and more serious than I was prepared to handle. "Dante," I started, then stopped, not sure how to continue. My name sounded different when he said it, like something precious rather than just a collection of syllables. "This is beautiful, but I can't. I don't understand how." "You don't have to understand everything tonight," he said gently. "You just have to know that what I'm offering you is real. I've watched you build your business, watched you pour everything you have into making other people's dreams come true. I've seen how he treated you, how he made you smaller when you deserved to shine. You're free now, Valentina. Let me show you what it feels like to be treasured instead of tolerated." The sincerity in his voice, the way he said my name like it was sacred, the patient certainty in his expression as he waited for my response, all of it combined to create a moment that felt suspended outside of time. Around us, the gala continued, guests laughing and dancing and bidding on auction items, but it felt like we existed in our own private bubble where only truth could survive. But before I could formulate a response, before I could begin to process the magnitude of what was happening, my phone rang again. Marcus. And this time, when I saw his name, there was something different about the way my stomach clenched, something that felt less like anxiety and more like pure dread. "I have to take this," I whispered to Dante, though every instinct screamed at me not to let Marcus intrude on this moment. Not to give him the power to ruin something that felt magical and terrifying and perfect all at once. Dante's expression darkened slightly, a shadow crossing his features that reminded me that while he might be gentle with me, he was definitely not a man to be underestimated. "Take it," he said quietly. "But know that whatever he says, whatever threats he makes, you don't have to face them alone anymore." The promise in his words, the protective edge that crept into his voice, sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming realization that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. The phone call with Marcus lasted exactly 93 seconds, and by the end of it, my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the device. His voice had been slurred with alcohol, his words alternating between desperate pleading and barely veiled threats that made my skin crawl with familiar dread. "Where are you, Valentina? You can't hide from me forever. We belong together, and you know it. I'll find you eventually, and when I do, we're going to have a very serious conversation about your behavior lately." When I finally ended the call, Dante was watching me with an expression that was equal parts concerned and furious. The gentle patience he'd shown moments earlier had been replaced by something harder, more dangerous, like steel wrapped in silk. Without saying a word, he guided me away from the main reception area and into a smaller adjacent room that served as a private office, his hand warm and steady against the small of my back. The office was quiet, insulated from the party's noise by heavy doors and thick walls. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, filled with what looked like first editions, while modern artwork hung opposite a massive mahogany desk. It was clearly Dante's personal space, sophisticated and masculine, with touches that spoke of old money and careful taste. "He's been calling you," Dante said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with the kind of certainty that suggested he'd been paying far more attention to my life than I'd ever realized. For weeks now, getting more aggressive each time. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process not just his words but the implications behind them. "How do you know that?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Part of me that was simultaneously thrilled and terrified by the possibility that this man had been watching over me from the shadows. "Because I've been watching," he said simply. "Not stalking, not interfering, but keeping an eye on you. Making sure you were safe. I saw how he treated you during your engagement, Valentina. The way he controlled your schedule, isolated you from your friends, made you question your own judgment about everything from your business decisions to what you wore. I saw how you started making yourself smaller, dimming your light to avoid setting him off." His words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. I'd thought I'd been so careful, so good at hiding the dysfunction of my relationship with Marcus behind a facade of professional competence and social propriety. But apparently, at least one person had seen through the carefully constructed lies I'd told myself about love and compromise and the price of being with someone. The worst part was that he was right. About all of it. Marcus had been controlling from almost the beginning, so subtle about it that I'd convinced myself his behavior was protectiveness rather than possession. He'd gradually isolated me from friends who asked too many questions, found reasons why I shouldn't take certain clients or attend industry events without him, made me feel guilty for every success that didn't somehow benefit him directly. By the end, I'd been a shadow of myself, apologizing for breathing too loudly and second-guessing every decision. I didn't think anyone noticed, I whispered, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could somehow contain the shame and embarrassment that threatened to overwhelm me. I thought I was handling it, managing the situation. I thought love was supposed to be hard work. "Love isn't supposed to make you disappear," Dante said quietly. "It's supposed to help you become more yourself, not less." I watched you fight to keep your business alive while he told you it wasn't a real career. I watched you make excuses for his behavior to mutual acquaintances. I watched you stop laughing the way you used to, stop lighting up when you talked about your work. The accuracy of his observations was devastating. When had I stopped laughing? When had my joy in event planning, in creating perfect moments for other people, become something I had to defend and justify? When had I started apologizing for taking up space in my own life? "You waited," I said, still trying to wrap my mind around the patient devotion that implied. "For 3 years, you watched me make mistakes and bad choices, and you just waited." "I waited because you weren't free," he replied, "and because I knew that when you finally were, you'd need time to remember who you really are. I couldn't rescue you from that relationship, Valentina. You had to save yourself. But I could make sure that when you did, you'd have somewhere safe to land." Before I could respond, before I could even begin to process the depth of care and respect embedded in his words, there was a commotion in the main reception area. Raised voices, the kind of disturbance that made every event coordinator's blood run cold. Through the office windows, I could see guests turning toward the entrance, their elegant postures shifting from relaxed socializing to concerned curiosity. That's when I saw him. Marcus, clearly drunk and absolutely furious, pushing past the security personnel at the elevator bank and stalking through the crowd with the single-minded determination of a man who'd moved beyond reason. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his hair messed from what looked like hours of running his hands through it in frustration. Oh God, I breathed, my entire body going cold with recognition and dread. He found me. I don't know how, but he found me. Dante's expression went absolutely arctic. Stay here, he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Do not leave this room. Do not try to handle this yourself. Let me deal with him. But even as he spoke, Marcus was scanning the crowd with the focused intensity of a predator searching for prey. When his gaze landed on the office windows, when he saw me standing there with Dante, his face twisted into something ugly and possessive that made my stomach lurch with familiar fear. Valentina, he shouted, his voice carrying over the music and conversation as he started pushing through the crowd toward us. There you are, baby. We need to talk. Now. The entire reception seemed to freeze. Hundreds of Manhattan's social elite suddenly focused on what was clearly about to become a very public scene. I could see my carefully orchestrated evening dissolving into chaos, my professional reputation crumbling as my personal drama played out in front of every influential contact I'd spent years cultivating. Dante moved before Marcus could reach the office door, intercepting him in the main reception area with a grace and speed that suggested this wasn't his first time dealing with an aggressive drunk. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but somehow carried to every corner of the room, commanding absolute attention. Mr. Holloway, he said, and hearing Marcus's last name delivered in that tone of controlled authority made something shift in the atmosphere of the entire room. You're not invited to this event. You need to leave. Now. The hell I'm leaving, Marcus slurred, swaying slightly but maintaining his aggressive posture. That's my fiancée in there. We're engaged. She belongs with me. Ms. Chun and I ended our engagement 6 weeks ago, Dante replied calmly. She's here tonight as the event coordinator for my foundation's gala. You're here as an unwelcome intruder who's disturbing my guests. Security will escort you out, or the police will. Your choice. There was something in Dante's tone, something in the way he held himself, that spoke of real power and the willingness to use it. This wasn't just wealth or social position. This was authority backed by something far more substantial and dangerous. The subtle change in his demeanor, the way even the security personnel seemed to defer to his judgment, suggested depths to his influence that I was only beginning to understand. Marcus seemed to sense it too, because some of the drunken bravado faded from his expression, replaced by a calculating wariness that was somehow more frightening than his earlier aggression. You think you can just take what's mine? He said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You think some money and a fancy party make you better than me? I think respect and basic human decency make me better than you, Dante replied evenly. And I think Ms. Chun deserves better than a man who shows up drunk to her place of work and calls her his possession. The security team moved closer, clearly awaiting Dante's signal, but Marcus held up his hands in mock surrender. Fine, he said, his smile cold and calculating. I'll go. But this isn't over, Valentina. You can't run from what we have forever. I'll be seeing you real soon. The threat in his words, the promise of future confrontation, sent ice through my veins. But before I could respond, before I could even step forward, Marcus had turned and stalked back toward the elevators, leaving behind a room full of curious guests and the lingering scent of expensive whiskey and desperation. Dante returned to the office within minutes, closing the door behind him and immediately moving to where I stood frozen by the windows. Without hesitation, he pulled me into his arms, and I let myself collapse against his chest, breathing in his warmth and strength while my entire body shook with delayed reaction. I'm sorry, I whispered against his shirt. I'm so sorry he ruined your event, embarrassed you in front of your guests. This is exactly why we can't. Hey, he said softly, his hand stroking gently through my hair. Look at me, Valentina. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing that happened tonight was your fault. But I dragged my mess into your life, I protested. My problems, my mistakes. You don't deserve to deal with Marcus's threats and drama. What you call your mess, I call the reason I fell in love with you, Dante said quietly. Your strength, your refusal to let him break you completely, your determination to build something beautiful despite everything he tried to tear down. That's not a burden, sweetheart. That's who you are. The endearment, delivered in his deep voice with such gentle certainty, nearly undid me completely. When was the last time someone had called me sweetheart and meant it as a term of affection rather than condescension? When was the last time someone had seen my struggles as evidence of strength rather than failure? He's not going to give up, I said, stating what we both knew to be true. Tonight was just the beginning. He'll escalate, get more aggressive. That's what he does when he doesn't get his way. I know, Dante replied, which is why you're coming home with me tonight. No arguments, no protests about propriety or moving too fast. Your safety is more important than convention, and I'm not letting you go back to your apartment alone knowing he's out there in this state. Part of me wanted to argue, to insist that I could take care of myself, that I didn't need a man to rescue me from another man's threats. But the larger part of me, the part that was tired of being afraid and alone and constantly looking over my shoulder, recognized the wisdom in his words. Marcus was escalating, and whatever was happening between Dante and me, I trusted him in a way I'd never trusted anyone. Okay, I said simply. Thank you. The gratitude in my voice seemed to affect him deeply, because something shifted in his expression, became even more tender and protective. We'll figure this out, he promised. All of it. But first, let's get you somewhere safe where you can breathe without worrying about who might be watching. Dante's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a pre-war building in the Upper East Side, the kind of address that whispered old money and understated power. As the private elevator opened directly into his foyer, I found myself stepping into a space that was both intimidating and oddly welcoming. Warm hardwood floors stretched beneath soaring ceilings, while oversized windows offered panoramic views of Central Park that made the city look like a glittering jewel box spread out below us. This is beautiful, I said softly, taking in the careful balance of antiques and modern pieces, the way warm lighting made everything feel lived in rather than museum perfect. And enormous. I think my entire apartment could fit in your living room. Dante helped me out of my coat, his fingers brushing against my shoulders in a way that sent heat racing through my already overwrought nervous system. I like having space, he said simply, but it gets lonely sometimes. Too much room for one person to rattle around in. There was something vulnerable in his admission, a glimpse beneath the controlled exterior that made my heart squeeze with unexpected tenderness. Here was this powerful, successful man who could clearly have anything he wanted, admitting to loneliness in a way that felt genuine rather than calculated. My phone buzzed against my clutch, and we both tensed. Marcus had been calling and texting obsessively since leaving the gala 2 hours ago, each message more erratic and demanding than the last. The most recent text had been particularly disturbing. You can't hide forever, baby. I know all your favorite places. We're going to talk, whether you want to or not. Dante had read that message over my shoulder in the car, and I'd watched his jaw tighten in a way that suggested Marcus had no idea how dangerous it was to threaten someone under Dante Romano's protection. Now, seeing my name flash across the screen again, he simply reached over and powered down my phone entirely. He can't reach you here, Dante said firmly. I've had security posted downstairs since we left the gala, and building access requires multiple clearances. You're safe, Valentina. Try to remember what that feels like. Safe. When was the last time I'd felt truly safe? Even during the best moments of my relationship with Marcus, there had always been an undercurrent of anxiety, a sense that I was walking on eggshells around his moods and expectations. But here, in this elegant space with this man who had waited 3 years to love me properly, something in my chest that had been clenched tight for months finally began to loosen. The guest room he showed me was larger than my current living room, with its own sitting area and an en-suite bathroom that featured a soaking tub I could probably swim in. Everything was decorated in soft blues and creams, feminine without being frilly, elegant without being intimidating. On the dresser, I noticed fresh flowers and what looked like expensive toiletries that definitely hadn't been there this morning. You had someone prepare this, I realized, touched by the thoughtfulness. You planned for me to stay here. I hoped you would, he admitted. but I would never have forced it. Your choice, always your choice. The emphasis he placed on my agency, the way he consistently gave me space to decide what I was comfortable with, stood in sharp contrast to everything I'd experienced with Marcus. This was what respect looked like, I realized. This was how a man behaved when he valued a woman's autonomy as much as her affection. After changing into more comfortable clothes, I found Dante in his kitchen, having traded his tuxedo for dark jeans and a soft gray sweater that made him look approachable in a way that was almost more devastating than his formal elegance. His hair was slightly messed from running his fingers through it, and seeing him relaxed and domestic in his own space did something dangerous to my already unsteady pulse. "Hungry?" he asked, already moving toward the refrigerator with the kind of easy competence that suggested he actually knew his way around a kitchen rather than relying entirely on staff or takeout. "I make a decent late-night omelet. Nothing fancy, but filling." I perched on one of the bar stools at his massive kitchen island, watching him move with surprising grace as he gathered ingredients. There was something hypnotic about seeing his large, capable hands crack eggs and dice vegetables, something that made my imagination wander in directions that definitely weren't appropriate for someone who'd been single for exactly 6 weeks. "You don't have to take care of me," I said, though my protest lacked conviction. "I'm not some helpless damsel who needs rescuing." "No," he agreed, pausing in his preparation to look directly at me. "You're a strong, successful woman who's been handling her problems alone for too long. There's a difference between needing rescue and deserving care, Valentina. I want to take care of you because you matter to me, not because I think you're incapable." His words settled over me like a warm blanket, filling spaces inside me that I hadn't realized were empty. When had anyone last wanted to take care of me simply because they cared? Marcus had performed gestures of care when it served his image or when he wanted something, but there had always been strings attached, always an expectation of gratitude or reciprocation that felt more like manipulation than affection. "Tell me about growing up," Dante said as he slid the omelet onto a plate and handed it to me along with perfectly toasted bread and fresh fruit. "What was little Valentina like?" The question caught me off guard, partly because it had been so long since anyone had shown genuine curiosity about my background, and partly because my childhood wasn't something I usually shared with people in my professional circle. The events industry was full of people who came from money and connections, and my scrappy origins often made clients assume I was somehow less qualified or sophisticated than my competitors. "Little Valentina was determined," I said carefully, testing the waters, "and probably too serious for her own good. My mom raised me alone after my father left when I was 8. She worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, cleaning office buildings at night, waitressing during the day, whatever it took. I learned early that if I wanted something, I had to work for it myself." Dante listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like every word mattered to him. No judgment, no pity, just genuine interest in understanding who I was and how I'd become that person. "I started working when I was 14, I continued, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. Babysitting, tutoring, helping with parties and events for neighbors. By the time I got to college, I knew I wanted to work in hospitality, creating perfect moments for people celebrating the most important days of their lives. But I was always conscious that I didn't have the same advantages as my classmates, the same family connections or financial safety nets." "Is that why you work so hard?" he asked gently. "Why you put so much pressure on yourself to be perfect at everything?" The insight was uncomfortably accurate. I did work too hard, did demand perfection from myself in ways that were probably unhealthy. Part of it was the natural drive that had gotten me out of poverty and into business ownership. But part of it was also the persistent fear that I didn't really belong in the world I'd fought to enter, that one mistake would expose me as the fraud I sometimes felt like. "I'm terrified of being seen as a gold digger," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Women like me, we're always suspect when we get involved with men like you. People assume we're in it for the money, that we're social climbers using our looks to land a wealthy husband. I've worked so hard to build my business, to prove that I belong in this world on my own merits. Getting involved with you, it complicates that narrative." Dante set down his coffee cup and reached across the island to cover my hand with his. His palm was warm and slightly rough, evidence that his wealth hadn't completely insulated him from physical work. Anyone who thinks you're a gold digger doesn't know you at all, he said firmly. I've watched you turn down lucrative contracts because you didn't think the clients respected your vision. I've seen you work 18-hour days to make sure every detail was perfect, even when the budget was tight and the timeline was impossible. You don't need my money, Valentina. You've built something beautiful entirely on your own. His confidence in my abilities, his clear respect for what I'd accomplished, meant more than he could possibly know. But before I could respond, before I could even begin to process the emotional impact of his words, his phone rang. The ringtone was different from his usual calls, urgent and demanding in a way that made him tense immediately. Romano, he answered, his voice shifting from warm and gentle to coldly professional in the space of a heartbeat. When? How did he get past the doorman? No, don't engage him directly. I'm on my way down. He ended the call and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts fury and concern. Marcus tried to break into your apartment building 20 minutes ago. The doorman called the police, but he ran before they arrived. My security team thinks he might try to come here next. The blood drained from my face as the implications hit me. Marcus wasn't just calling and texting anymore. He was actively trying to find me, breaking into buildings, escalating his harassment to a level that felt genuinely dangerous. What had I been thinking, bringing this chaos into Dante's life? What kind of woman dragged her psychotic ex-fiancé's threats into the home of a man who was trying to love her? Hey, Dante said softly, clearly reading the panic in my expression. This is not your fault. You didn't create this situation, and you're not responsible for his behavior. But I am responsible for keeping you safe, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. He moved with swift efficiency, making several phone calls that I couldn't quite follow, but that clearly involved coordinating some kind of security response. When he spoke, his tone carried an authority that reminded me that whatever else Dante Romano was, he was definitely not someone to underestimate. There were depths to his power that went far beyond wealth, connections that ran deeper than social position. But seeing him like this, watching him transform from gentle caretaker to dangerous protector, also revealed something else. His fury at the threat to me was real and profound. This wasn't just chivalry or male possessiveness. This was a man protecting someone he genuinely cared about, someone whose safety mattered more to him than convenience or social nicety. Will you hurt him? I asked quietly, not sure what answer I was hoping for. Only if he tries to hurt you, Dante replied honestly. I don't start fights, Valentina, but I always finish them. The promise in his voice, the absolute certainty that he would do whatever was necessary to keep me safe, should have frightened me. Instead, for the first time in months, I felt something that might actually have been peace. Marcus could threaten and stalk and try to manipulate me all he wanted. But he was no longer my problem to handle alone. I'm scared, I admitted, the words barely a whisper. But not of you. Of him, of what he might do. But not of you. Dante pulled me into his arms then, and I let myself sink into his warmth and strength. For just a moment, standing in his kitchen with his arms around me and his heart beating steadily beneath my cheek, I felt completely safe. Protected. Cherished. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. 3 days later, I found Dante in his home office at 2 a.m, surrounded by multiple computer screens displaying what looked like security camera footage from various locations around the city. The blue glow from the monitors cast shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw and the exhaustion around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent watching over me. I'd been staying at the penthouse since the night of the gala, and while the days had been filled with a careful dance of domestic intimacy that made my heart race and my defenses crumble, the nights had been punctuated by phone calls and hushed conversations that reminded me of the dangerous reality lurking just outside our temporary bubble of safety. You should be sleeping, I said softly from the doorway, not wanting to startle him, but unable to stay in the guest room any longer knowing he was out here, standing guard over my peace of mind. He looked up from the screens, and something in his expression shifted when he saw me standing there in one of his dress shirts that I'd borrowed as sleepwear, my hair loose around my shoulders and my feet bare on his expensive hardwood floors. The shirt hung to mid-thigh on my smaller frame, and I was suddenly conscious of how little I was wearing, how intimate this felt despite the circumstances that had brought us here. Can't sleep, he said simply. Every time I close my eyes, I think about what could have happened if you'd gone home alone that night. If he'd been waiting in your apartment, instead of trying to break in from outside. The protective edge in his voice, the way his hands clenched into fists at the thought of Marcus hurting me, sent warmth flooding through my chest in a way that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with being genuinely cared for by someone who had the power to do something about it. But I didn't go home alone, I pointed out gently, crossing the room to stand behind his chair. I'm here, safe, because you made sure of it. You can't protect me from threats that only exist in your imagination, Dante. He reached up to cover my hand where it rested on his shoulder, his thumb stroking across my knuckles in a gesture that was becoming familiar and precious. That's just it, he said quietly. My world, the things I've done to build what I have, the enemies I've made along the way, they're not imagination. They're real, and they're dangerous, and getting close to me puts you in the crosshairs of people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt you to get to me. The vulnerability in his admission, the fear that I could hear beneath his controlled exterior, made my heart ache for him in a way I hadn't expected. Here was a man who commanded respect and wielded considerable power, terrified that his strength might become my weakness. Is that why you waited so long? I asked. Why you kept your distance even after you knew I was unhappy with Marcus? Because you were afraid your world would hurt me? Partly, he admitted, and partly because I knew that if I had you, really had you, I'd burn down anyone and anything that threatened to take you away from me. That level of possessiveness, that willingness to use violence to protect what's mine, it's not something every woman can accept. His honesty, the way he laid out his capacity for darkness alongside his capacity for love, should have frightened me. A month ago, it would have sent me running back to the safety of my controlled, predictable life. But 3 days of being cared for by this man, 3 days of seeing his gentleness and his respect for my choices, had shown me the difference between possessiveness born of love and possessiveness born of control. I'm falling in love with you, I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them or analyze them into submission. I've been trying to resist it, trying to tell myself it's too fast and too complicated and too dangerous. But I can't stop thinking about the way you look at me, the way you touch me like I'm something precious. I can't stop wanting to know what it would feel like to be yours completely. The effect of my words on him was immediate and electric. His chair swiveled so he could look up at me, his green-gray eyes dark with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. Without breaking eye contact, he stood slowly, his hands coming up to frame my face with a reverence that made my knees weak. Say it again, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Tell me you want to be mine. I want to be yours, I whispered, my hands fisting in the soft material of his sweater as I pulled him closer. I want to forget about being scared and careful and appropriate. I want you to show me what it feels like to be loved by someone who sees all of me and wants me anyway. He kissed me then, and it was nothing like the careful, respectful kisses we'd shared over the past few days. This was claiming, possessive in the best possible way, his mouth moving over mine with a hunger that spoke of 3 years of waiting and wanting. My back hit the office wall as he pressed closer, his hands tangling in my hair while I lost myself in the taste of him, the feel of his body solid and warm against mine. When he lifted me, my legs wrapped around his waist instinctively, and the sensation of being carried by him, completely supported and surrounded by his strength, sent heat racing through my entire body. The guest room seemed miles away as he carried me through the darkened penthouse to his master suite, laying me down on his bed with a gentleness that contrasted beautifully with the barely leashed desire I could see in his expression. Are you sure? He asked, his hand stroking softly through my hair as he searched my face for any sign of hesitation. We can wait, Valentina. We have time. I don't want to wait, I replied honestly. I don't want to be careful anymore. I want to feel alive again, and you make me feel more alive than I have in years. What followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before, tender and passionate, and completely focused on connection rather than conquest. He touched me like he was memorizing every curve and sensitive spot, like my pleasure was the most important thing in his world. When I showed him the lingering emotional scars from Marcus's manipulations, the ways I'd learned to make myself small and accommodate someone else's needs, he seemed to make it his personal mission to erase those patterns with patience and worship and genuine care for my experience. Afterward, lying tangled together in his massive bed with the city lights painting patterns across our skin, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete rightness. Like every choice I'd made, every mistake and triumph and heartbreak had led me to this moment with this man who loved me enough to wait and strong enough to protect what we were building together. The next morning brought coffee in bed and lazy conversation, and the kind of domestic intimacy that felt like a glimpse into a possible future that was both thrilling and terrifying in its perfection. When Marco Salvetti arrived for what was clearly a scheduled business meeting, I saw another side of Dante's world that was both reassuring and sobering. Marco was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence and quiet authority that suggested he was far more than just an employee. When Dante introduced me, simply saying, "This is Valentina, the woman I'm going to marry," Marco's reaction told me everything I needed to know about his loyalty and his role in Dante's organization. "Ma'am," Marco said, inclining his head with genuine respect, "it's an honor. The boss has been talking about you for years." The casual acceptance, the way Marco immediately included me in their circle without question or judgment, felt like another piece of evidence that I was making the right choice in trusting Dante with my heart and my future. But the business they discussed, conducted in careful euphemisms and coded language that I was only beginning to understand, reminded me that love alone wouldn't erase the complexity of the world I was choosing to enter. When Marco mentioned that they'd identified the private investigator Marcus had hired to track my movements, when Dante's expression went absolutely cold as he made decisions about eliminating threats permanently, I was forced to confront the reality that my safety might require actions I wasn't sure I was prepared to accept. "He won't stop," Dante said after Marco left, his voice matter-of-fact, but his eyes watchful as he waited for my reaction. "The investigator, Marcus, the escalating harassment, none of it stops until we make it stop. Are you prepared for what that means?" The question hung between us like a challenge and a test, and I realized that this was the moment that would define not just our relationship, but who I was going to become. Was I brave enough to love a man whose protection might require violence? Was I strong enough to build a life that included moral complexities I'd never had to navigate before? Looking into his eyes, seeing the love and the darkness and the absolute determination to keep me safe, I found my answer. "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm prepared. Do what you have to do." The call came at 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing vendor contracts in Dante's home office, feeling more settled and secure than I had in months. Sophia's voice was barely a whisper, tight with terror that made my blood run cold even before I understood what she was trying to tell me. "Valentina," she breathed, and I could hear the tears in her voice. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but he made me call you. He says if you don't come alone, if you bring anyone with you, he'll hurt me. Please, I don't want to die." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone with a sick certainty that everything Dante and I had been building was about to come crashing down around us. Marcus had Sophia, my assistant, my friend, the 24-year-old recent graduate who had become like a little sister to me over the past year. He had taken an innocent person and turned her into leverage against me. When I told Dante, his reaction was immediate and volcanic. The careful control he maintained dissolved into something primal and furious that transformed his entire being. He made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, his voice clipped and deadly as he mobilized resources I didn't fully understand. "You're not going," he said when he finished, his tone brooking no argument. "This is exactly what he wants, to draw you out into the open where he can take you. We'll find another way to get Sophia back." But even as he spoke, my phone buzzed with a text message that included a photo that made my stomach lurch. Sophia, bound to a chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, her eyes wide with terror and a gag across her mouth. The message that followed was pure Marcus. 1 hour. Come alone. The address is attached. Bring your boyfriend, and she dies screaming. "I have to go," I said quietly, and something in my voice made Dante freeze in the middle of reaching for his phone. "If I don't, he'll kill her. You know he will. He's escalated past rational thought, past caring about consequences. The only thing he wants is to hurt me, and he'll destroy anyone in his path to make that happen." "Valentina." "No," Dante said, his voice rough with something that sounded like panic. You have no idea what you're walking into. This is a trap, sweetheart. He doesn't want to talk to you. He wants to punish you for leaving him. And if you go there alone, I'll never see you alive again. The fear in his voice, the way his hands shook slightly as he reached for me, broke my heart. But it also strengthened my resolve. Sophia was in danger because of me, because Marcus's obsession with controlling me had expanded to include anyone who mattered to me. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to her, because I chose safety over courage. I have to try, I said firmly. But I'm not as helpless as he thinks I am. And I'm not the same woman who used to let him control me through fear and manipulation. I've learned some things about strength and love and what's worth fighting for. Dante pulled me against his chest then, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I felt the tremor that ran through his powerful body at the thought of losing me. When he spoke, his voice was muffled against my hair, but carried absolute conviction. If you're going, then I'm going too. Not close enough for him to see me, not in a way that puts Sophia at risk, but close enough to end this the moment I have a clear shot. You're not facing him alone, Valentina. Never again. The warehouse was exactly the kind of place Marcus would choose for a confrontation, isolated and industrial with plenty of shadows for hiding and soundproofing to muffle screams. As I approached the specified entrance, my heart hammered against my ribs with a combination of terror and determination that felt strangely liberating. For the first time in our entire relationship, I was walking toward Marcus on my own terms, making my own choice about how this would end. He was waiting for me in the center of the main floor, standing behind Sophia's chair like some twisted parody of protection. She was alive and appeared unharmed, though the tears streaming down her face and the way she flinched when he touched her shoulder made rage surge through me in a way I'd never experienced before. "There's my beautiful girl," Marcus said, his voice carrying the false warmth that had once made me think he loved me. "You look good, baby. Different. Stronger. I like it. It'll make breaking you again so much more satisfying." "Let her go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "This is between you and me, Marcus. Sophia has nothing to do with whatever you think I owe you." "What you owe me," he repeated, his expression shifting from false affection to something ugly and possessive. "You owe me everything, Valentina. 2 years of my life. 2 years of building something together. And you threw it all away for what? Some rich bastard who thinks he can buy you like a piece of jewelry?" The comparison stung because it echoed my own fears about being seen as a gold digger, but it also revealed how little Marcus had ever understood about what I wanted or who I was. Even now, faced with losing me forever, he could only see me as property to be owned rather than a person with agency and desires of my own. "I didn't throw anything away," I replied firmly. "I chose to leave a relationship that was slowly destroying who I am. And I chose to be with someone who sees my strength instead of trying to diminish it. Someone who trusts me to make my own decisions instead of controlling every aspect of my life." "That someone being your new boyfriend?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "The one who thinks he's so much better than me because he has money and connections? Where is he now, Valentina? Why isn't he here protecting his investment?" The crude way he spoke about Dante, the assumption that our relationship was transactional rather than genuine, triggered something fierce and protective in me that I didn't even know I possessed. Before I could stop myself, before I could consider the wisdom of provoking him further, the words came pouring out with passionate conviction. "He's not here because I asked him not to be," I said clearly. "Because I needed to face you myself, to tell you to your face that what we had wasn't love. It was control disguised as care, possession masquerading as protection. Dante Romano loves me in ways you never could, Marcus. He sees me as an equal partner, not a possession to be managed. He makes me stronger instead of smaller. And yes, I love him more than I ever loved you, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to hurt to something that looked like genuine grief before finally settling into cold, calculated rage. The transformation was terrifying in its completeness, like watching a mask finally slip away to reveal the monster that had always been lurking underneath. "If I can't have you," he said quietly, reaching into his jacket to pull out a gun that gleamed dully in the warehouse's dim lighting, "then nobody can. You made your choice, baby. Now live with the consequences." But before he could raise the weapon fully, before he could point it at me or Sophia or himself, the warehouse exploded into controlled chaos. Dante and 3 other men materialized from the shadows with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. The confrontation was over before Marcus could even process what was happening, his gun spinning away across the concrete floor as Dante's Lieutenant Marco tackled him with efficient brutality. Sophia was freed and ushered to safety within seconds, her restraints cut and her exit path cleared by professionals who treated her rescue as just another job to be completed with maximum efficiency. I found myself pulled against Dante's chest, his arms wrapping around me protectively while his men secured the area with the kind of methodical thoroughness that left no room for Marcus to pose any future threat. "It's over," Dante murmured against my hair, his voice rough with relief and residual fear. "He can't hurt you anymore, sweetheart. He can't hurt anyone anymore." I should have felt guilty about the finality in his voice, should have been horrified by the violence that had been necessary to end Marcus's threats permanently. Instead, standing in that warehouse with the smell of dust and fear and inevitability hanging in the air, I felt something that could only be described as profound relief. The nightmare was over. The man who had spent months terrorizing me and threatening people I cared about would never again have the power to make me afraid. When I pulled back to look into Dante's eyes, I saw my own realization reflected there. This was who we were together. This was what love looked like when it was backed by the strength to protect what mattered most. His darkness didn't diminish the light between us. It made that light possible by ensuring that nothing could extinguish it. "I love you," I said quietly, the words carrying weight they'd never held before. "All of you. The gentleman who makes me breakfast and the protector who eliminates threats. I choose this life, Dante. I choose you, and everything that comes with loving you." The smile that spread across his face was radiant with joy and relief, and when he kissed me there in that warehouse where my old life had finally died, it felt like a promise and a beginning all at once. 2 weeks after the warehouse, I found myself standing in the exact spot where this whole incredible journey had begun. The same penthouse, the same floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Manhattan's glittering skyline, but everything was different now. I was different. The woman who had discovered a wedding ring in her champagne glass that night had been afraid of her own shadow, terrified of trusting her heart to someone who might break it. The woman standing here now knew what it felt like to be truly loved, truly protected, truly seen for everything she was. Dante had recreated the charity gala down to the smallest detail, complete with the same catering staff and string quartet. But tonight, there were only 2 guests. Just him and me, and the question he'd been carrying for 3 years finally ready to be asked properly. The ring sat at the bottom of my champagne flute exactly as it had before, but this time when I lifted it out, my hands weren't shaking with shock and confusion. This time, I knew exactly what it meant and exactly what my answer would be. "Valentina Chun," Dante said, dropping to one knee right there in the middle of his living room with the city spread out behind him like a backdrop designed specifically for this moment. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how precious you are to me?" "Yes," I whispered, tears streaming down my face as he slipped the perfect ring onto my finger where it belonged. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. I'll trust you with my heart and my future and everything I am." When he kissed me, it tasted like champagne bubbles and promises and the kind of happiness I'd never believed was possible for someone like me. This was what love was supposed to feel like, I realized. Safe and exciting at the same time, grounding and uplifting, a partnership that made both people stronger rather than requiring one to become smaller. The months that followed were a whirlwind of wedding planning and business growth, and meeting the extended Romano family, who welcomed me with warmth that sometimes overwhelmed my emotions. Dante's Aunt Maria, his late mother's sister, took me under her wing with the kind of maternal care I'd missed since my own mother had passed away 5 years earlier. She taught me family recipes and shared stories about Dante as a boy, painting pictures of a sensitive child who had grown into a powerful man without losing his capacity for gentleness. My event planning business flourished under the protection and connections that came with being Dante Romano's fiancé, but in ways that felt earned rather than handed to me. The referrals came because previous clients recommended my work, not because anyone owed Dante favors. The contracts grew larger because my reputation for excellence had spread, not because people were afraid to say no. I was building something that was mine while being supported by someone who wanted to see me succeed. Our wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the kind of October morning that made Central Park look like it had been painted in gold and crimson just for us. We'd chosen intimate over extravagant, gathering our closest family and friends in the conservatory garden where we'd had our first real conversation about the future. My dress was simple but elegant, with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that made me feel like the best version of myself rather than someone trying to be someone else. When I walked down the aisle on Marco's arm, since he'd become like a brother to me over the months of planning, Dante's expression made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. His eyes never left mine as I approached, and I could see the love and awe and gratitude written across his face so clearly that several guests reached for tissues before the ceremony even began. The vows we exchanged were personal and specific, written from the heart rather than copied from sample ceremonies. When Dante promised to love all of me, the strength and the vulnerability, the ambition and the fears, the woman I was and the woman I was becoming, his voice cracked with emotion that made my own tears flow freely. When I promised to trust him with my dreams and my safety, to build something beautiful together that honored both our individual strengths and our partnership, to love him in all the ways he'd taught me were possible, I meant every word with a certainty that went bone deep. Our first dance was to the same jazz song that had been playing the night I found the ring, and as we swayed together in the middle of our reception with our family and friends watching, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. This was home, I realized. Not the penthouse or the business or the security, but this feeling of being completely known and completely loved by someone who would move mountains to keep me safe and happy. That night, in the honeymoon suite of the hotel where we decided to spend our first night as husband and wife before flying to Italy for 2 weeks, Dante made love to me with a reverence and passion that felt like worship. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered endearment reinforced what we'd promised each other in front of our families. This was forever. This was real. This was the beginning of something that would only grow stronger with time. Mrs. Romano, he murmured against my skin as we lay tangled together afterward, and the way he said my new name made my heart skip with pure joy. How does it feel to be married to a man who's been crazy about you for 3 years? It feels like coming home, I replied honestly. Like everything I went through before was just preparing me to appreciate this, to be worthy of this kind of love. You were always worthy, sweetheart, he said firmly. You just needed someone who could see it clearly enough to wait for you to see it too. 1 year later, I stood in the same penthouse preparing for our first anniversary party, a smaller version of the charity gala that had brought us together. The Romano Foundation's annual memorial dinner had become our tradition, a way to honor his mother's memory while celebrating the life we'd built together. The past 12 months had been everything I dreamed marriage could be and more. My business had expanded to include destination weddings and corporate retreats, with Sophia now serving as my full partner rather than just my assistant. Dante had gradually brought me into the legitimate side of his business operations, valuing my organizational skills and strategic thinking in ways that made me feel truly useful rather than just ornamental. But tonight was special for reasons beyond our anniversary. Tonight, I had news that would change everything in the most wonderful way possible. I waited until the evening was winding down, until our guests had offered their toasts and shared their memories, and gradually drifted toward home. When it was just Dante and me standing in the same spot where he'd first revealed his heart, I handed him a champagne flute that contained something far more precious than jewelry. At the bottom of the glass, printed on elegant cardstock, were the words that would make this the best anniversary gift I could possibly give him. Baby Romano, arriving July 2025. His reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. The shock, the joy, the immediate protective instinct that made him pull me against his chest like he could shield our unborn child from the entire world. When he looked at me with tears in his eyes and wonder in his expression, I saw our future reflected there. Sunday mornings with coffee and cartoons, birthday parties and bedtime stories, teaching our children about love and strength and the importance of protecting what matters most. "I love our life together," he whispered, echoing the words he'd spoken that first night when everything had changed. "And I can't wait to love our family." As we swayed together to music only we could hear, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows like stars that had fallen to earth just for us, I thought about that scared, lonely woman who had found a ring in her champagne glass 1 year ago. She'd been so afraid of trusting someone, so convinced that love meant losing herself rather than finding herself. Now, with my husband's arms around me and our child growing beneath my heart, and a future stretching ahead of us that was brighter than anything I'd ever dared to imagine, I knew the truth about love. Real love didn't make you smaller or weaker or more afraid. Real love made you brave enough to become who you were meant to be, strong enough to build something beautiful, and wise enough to recognize when someone was offering you everything you'd never known you needed. The ring on my finger caught the light as I lifted my hand to touch Dante's face, and I smiled at the memory of that night when my entire world had changed with a single question and a leap of faith. Sometimes the most incredible journeys began with the simplest choice. The choice to say yes when love finally found you. The choice to trust someone with your heart. The choice to believe that you deserve the kind of happiness you'd only ever seen in fairy tales. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, that choice led you home. What did you think of Valentina and Dante's love story? Have you ever had to make a choice between safety and the possibility of something extraordinary? I'd love to hear about the moments in your own life when love surprised you or when you had to be brave enough to trust someone with your heart.